One was far away, but it had undoubtedly been precipitated by the revolution and would have important consequences for it. In the third week of October 1791, reports began to arrive in France of a slave uprising in Saint Domingue. It was December before the full scale of the outbreak became clear. But by then, it was known that it had begun in the sugar estates in the north of the colony on 14 August, and initial losses were estimated at over 1,000 whites massacred, 200 sugar and 1,200 coffee plantations destroyed, and 15,000 slaves missing. It was to develop into the greatest slave rebellion in the history of the world, and the only successful one. Pessimists had been predicting something like it for a generation. As the colony boomed and demand for slaves grew insatiably, in the confrontations over political rights between whites and coloreds that had marked the years between 1789 and 1791. Both sides had drafted slaves into their retinues, heedless of the example it gave, and the failure of the Constituent Assembly to produce a coherent or consistent policy on slavery, the slave trade, the rights of free people of color, and colonial autonomy itself compounded the confusion both in Saint Domingue and in France's other West Indian islands. By the end of 1791, the rebellion had become part of a complex civil war, so fast-moving that any response decided in Paris was never less than 3 months out of date by the time news of it came through. These events were embarrassing for Brissac, who had been among the founders of the French anti-slavery movement in the 1780s, and for his eloquent friends from Bordeaux, a city whose prosperity was closely tied to the Caribbean slave economy. But apart from shocking stories of rapine and racial massacre, the first consequence of the rebellion was a severe shortage of sugar, which made itself felt in Paris in January 1792, when prices tripled. Throughout that month and into February, there were outbursts of popular price fixing in the eastern districts of the capital, as largely female crowds raided warehouses and grocers' shops and sold sugar and coffee they found there at the old prices. For once, they were not worried about grain, flour, or bread. But this was because the Paris authorities, remembering 1789, had taken steps to build up good stocks early in the autumn. in the process diminishing the reserves of a wide radius around the city. Accordingly, the winter saw repeated outbursts of grain rioting in little market towns all over northeastern France. In February, the mayor of Étampes was lynched when he refused to order a reduction in grain prices, and hundreds of National Guards had to be sent to restore order. An attempt to export grain from Dunkirk in the same month provoked 3 days of disorder in which many of the port's warehouses were destroyed. What compounded popular worries over the price of foodstuffs was a striking decline in the value of both the French livre and the assignats. The livre fell by 20% on the foreign exchanges between June 1791 and 1792. The assignats, still trading in Paris at 82% of their face value in November 1791, had fallen to 63% 2 months later and continued to decline gently throughout the spring. Both trends inevitably pushed up prices, especially of imported goods. Thus, even in a port like Marseille, with easy access to grain supplies from southern Europe and North Africa, prices climbed steadily throughout the spring, and the municipality darkly threatened merchant hoarders with revenge which would not be that of the law. Marseille, in fact, was now a byword for political turbulence, stung by the Constituent Assembly's decision to make the capital of the new department of Bouches-du-Rhône. The Marseillais sought to establish their regional primacy by intervention in other cities' affairs. In July 1791, 500 volunteers from Marseille helped to ensure the triumph of annexationists in Avignon. In September, they planned a march by National Guard contingents from all over the department on Arles, now the main regional center of counter-revolution, under the control of a refractory party known as the Chiffon. Only direct orders from Paris stopped them. Nothing, however, prevented them from marching to Aix the following February, disarming its garrison of regulars who were suspected of favoring the Chiffon, and then turning to Arles once again, with politicians in Paris totally absorbed by the impending war. In March, a force 6,000 strong was able to lay siege to the city, take it, and expel the Chiffon leaders. Such confrontations could not fail to increase tension, generally in a region that had been bitterly polarized already for almost 2 years. and the drowning of 69 National Guards in the treacherous Rhone at Pont Saint-Esprit on 25th March proved the trigger for a wave of rural violence in the South, unparalleled since July 1789. Nobody believed the drownings were accidental, and as rumors of them spread, those who heard them assumed they were part of a counter-revolutionary plot to avenge the dispersal of the Second Jealous Camp, the Avignon prison massacre, and all the other patriotic triumphs in which National Guardsmen had had a hand. All over the Guard, peasants now struck out at suspects and their property, which meant above all non-juring priests and nobles. In that single department in April 1792, 101 incidents were recorded of attacks on castles, ransacking their contents, and removing remaining symbols and records of feudalism. Nor was the outburst confined to the Guard. In neighboring Ardèche, among properties completely destroyed, were those of the most notorious, though long immigrated, coordinator of counter-revolutionary schemes, Count d'Entraigues. And down to June, the movement spread east into Provence, northward into Massif, and as far west as the Haute-Garonne, although with steadily diminishing intensity. What it signified is hard to decide, but the concentration on the relics of feudalism suggests that Southern peasants considered the gains of 1789 to be by no means firmly assured, and indeed in real danger of reversal, if the reactionaries of Arles and Avignon were to triumph. The Pont Saint-Esprit disaster suggested that plots might yet succeed where confrontation had failed, and with central government either indifferent to or incapable of imposing order on the lacerated Midi, harassed peasants took the law into their own hands to make sure that the destruction of the old social order would be irreparable. Nothing, however, did more to make that certain than the war which had just begun. During the first few weeks of war, the confidence and enthusiasm which had swept the Legislative Assembly into, it seems to have been widely shared. The Austrian alliance, always unpopular, had at last been broken, and the revolution was about to confront its enemies openly. The sense of defiance was well conveyed in the bloodthirsty words of the battle hymn composed for the Army of the Rhine at Strasbourg on 25th through 6th April by Rouget de Lisle, a poetical infantry captain. impure blood it exulted would drench the tracks of the conquering French armies, and the blood of enemies found on the home front would be shed in a way that was also new that month by the guillotine. The first proposal for a machine to make heads fly off in the twinkling of an eye had been laughed out of the Constituent Assembly in December 1789. But once the deputies had voted over the protests of Robespierre to retain the death penalty, something more reliable and humane than previous barbaric techniques seemed desirable. And in the course of 1791, a mechanical decapitator was devised. It was expeditious, egalitarian, and above all, experts agreed, painless, though not the invention of Dr. Guillotine. The original idea had been his, and it took his name. Its first victim was a highwayman who mounted the scaffold on 25th of April. Only a few days later, the war itself claimed its first victim. He was not, however, a hireling of the King of Hungary and Bohemia, but a French general murdered by his own men. The nearest enemy territory was Belgium, and it was assumed that the population there, resentful of the Austrian reconquest of 1790, would welcome freedom-proclaiming French troops with open arms. So the campaign began on 28th April with a modest advance across the northeast frontier. But at the first resistance, French ranks broke, and in their flight from the field, the troops turned on a commander whom they suspected of treason. Nor were they the only unit to turn tail. Desertion rates in the cavalry doubled, and even troops who remained reliable were unable to advance with their flanks uncertain. Fortunately, the Austrians were not well placed to advance either, preferring to wait until a concerted attack could be launched with Prussia, who did not declare war until 21 May and did not expect to have forces in a position to attack until the end of June. Meanwhile, the shock of the first defeats produced loud recriminations in Paris. Frantic to find scapegoats for reverses their own rhetoric had done nothing to prepare them for. The Brissotins, as the advocates of war in the assembly and the ministry were now known, turned to denouncing everybody else. Everywhere, noted a moderate Jacobin Club member, you hear the cry that the king is betraying us. The generals are betraying us. That nobody is to be trusted. That the Austrian committee has been caught in the act. That Paris will be taken in 6 weeks by the Austrians. We are on a volcano ready to spout flames. New measures to combat treasonable activity were now proposed and rapidly passed. On 18th May, all foreigners in Paris were placed under surveillance. On 27 May, the Assembly returned to the question of refractory priests, with a decree which allowed the deportation of any non-juror denounced by 20 active citizens. On the 29th, it decreed the disbanding of the special bodyguard of 1,800 men allowed to the king under the Constitution, suspected of excessive personal loyalty to a monarch nobody now trusted. They were to be replaced by reliably patriotic National Guardsmen. The king sanctioned the disbandment of his guard with a speed which left his enemies more suspicious than ever. Amid fears of a military coup, it was decided to send all regular troops stationed in and around Paris to the front. To replace them, the Minister of War, Servan, proposed to establish a camp of 20,000 or more National Guards. This time, provincial ones, just outside the capital. Their arrival was to coincide with the annual feast of the Federation on 14 July, and for that reason, they would be known as Fédérés. A decree convoking them was passed on 8th of June, but in the king's eyes, this was too much. And in any case, 2 days later, he glimpsed an unexpected opportunity to divide his enemies. Officers of the Paris National Guard, jealous of their preeminent role in metropolitan politics, organized a so-called petition of 8,000 against the camp. Thereupon, the king intimated to his ministers that he proposed to veto the new decree, along with that on refractory priests. A ministerial crisis now broke into the open. Roland, prompted by his ambitious young wife and supported by Servan and Clavière, wrote a public letter to the king on 10th June denouncing his delays in sanctioning decrees supported by the majority in the assembly and blaming the disturbed state of the country on royal behavior. Much more delay and a grieving people will see in its king the friend and accomplice of conspirators. No monarch could let pass such public criticism from one of his own ministers, and Roland found himself dismissed. Servan and Clavière fell with him on 13 June. Dumouriez, no sympathizer with the ousted trio, but no better liked by the king, followed them on the 15th. He went to a command on the northern front. The fallen ministers were replaced by fuyant non-entities, puppets, some said, of Lafayette. This impression was only reinforced when on 16th of June the general himself wrote an open letter from the front to the assembly, in which he denounced the Jacobins as the cause of all the recent troubles and disasters, and welcomed the fall of a ministry foisted on the country by a faction. His intervention merely confirmed suspicions widespread, since he had been given a command that he was planning a military coup. To forestall him, however, supporters of the fallen ministers in Paris were now planning a very different sort of coup. Popular intervention on a scale not seen since the ill-fated Champ de Mars petition the year before. The economic shortages of the spring had reinvigorated popular organizations dormant or operating underground since the previous summer. The number of sections with popular societies, which unlike the formal select sectional assemblies, were not confined to active citizens, probably doubled over the spring. By June, most sections in the heavily populated eastern and central districts had them. Renewed popular interest in political demonstrations was shown on 15 April when thousands attended a celebration to mark the release of those imprisoned after the Nancy Mutiny of 1790. With leading Jacobins also present. New leaders were emerging too, such as the self-named Anaxagoras Chomet, who led a radical secession from the Cordeliers Club, or Jacques Roux, a constitutional priest with a parish in the Gravelliers section, whose reputation was built on inflammatory sermons calling for price controls and death to the hoarders. The early reverses of the war surprised and alarmed sectional patriots, deluded like Jacobins by their own rhetoric. And throughout May, they bombarded the legislation with petitions to allow sectional assemblies to sit continuously en permanence during the emergency. Nothing united them more, however, than the purge of the ministers and to demonstrate support for them. The sections of the city's East End, coordinated from the Cordeliers, planned a vast demonstration to intimidate the king into taking them back. Ostensibly, the occasion was to be the planting of a tree of liberty in the Tuileries Gardens on the anniversary of the tennis court oath. But everybody knew that, as the American ambassador noted in his diary. There is to be a sort of riot tomorrow. Accordingly, on the morning of 20th of June, between 10,000 and 20,000 armed demonstrators converged on the Tuileries from the east in menacing silence. The palace guards made no attempt to stop them as they dragged cannon up the grand staircase and made for the king's apartments. Now they began to shout slogans, proclaiming that they were sans-culottes, ordinary patriots without fine clothes, come to intimidate tyrants. They found the king alone, and for 2 hours filed past him uttering threats and demanding the minister's reinstatement. But now, for the first time, Louis XVI showed the unexpected courage which dignified the last months of his dismal life and reign. He refused to be intimidated. He proclaimed his loyalty to the Constitution. He even borrowed one of the fashionable new caps of liberty, and wearing it, drank to the health of the nation. In the end, Pétion arrived from the Hôtel de Ville and persuaded the demonstrators to go home empty-handed. In the short term, therefore, the demonstration of 20th June failed. The king kept his ministers, and as the news of the invasion of the palace spread through the country, there was a wave of sympathy for the royal family. Many departments sent in condemnatory addresses to the National Assembly, some with thousands of signatures. The king upbraided Pétion in public for neglect of his duties as mayor in not preventing the demonstration, and the Department of Paris seized the opportunity to suspend him. Lafayette, too, saw a chance to intensify his campaign against the radicals, and on 28th June appeared in Paris to urge the National Guard to rally around the crown. Yet none of this deterred those who had organized the Journée of the 20th. It merely confirmed their conviction that they would have to try again. Indeed, as early as 23rd June, they attempted to do so, carrying a petition for the king's deposition. But their organization was not well enough established to mobilize another display of popular strength so soon, and the turnout proved inadequate. It was enough, however, to make them redouble their efforts, and the suspension of Pétion gave them a new cause to rally round. The Assembly's cool reception of Lafayette encouraged them too. He was accused of deserting his post in time of war, and, spurned by the royal family too, returned to the front in despair. At the Tuileries, meanwhile, courtiers were going about armed and preparing defensive positions. All sides were obviously expecting a further, and this time decisive, confrontation. And the precedent of 20th June, together with its lessons, indicated the form it would take. In this sense, the American ambassador was right when he wrote, "The Constitution has this day, I think, given its last groan." Anniversaries increasingly dominated the revolutionary calendar, and the greatest of all was now imminent, 14 July. And although the king had vetoed Servan's proposed camp of 20,000 fédérés, the usual parade on the Champ de Mars was still planned, with National Guards present from throughout the nation. On the news of the 20th June demonstration, centers of patriotism like Brest or Marseille decided to increase their contingents, and thus something like the camp would come into existence anyway. On 5th of July, the Assembly reinforced this trend by elaborating a procedure for declaring the country in danger. As soon as the state was proclaimed, all government bodies were placed in permanent session and authorized to raise volunteers from their National Guard units to fight at the front alongside the Line Army. Less than a week later, the decree was invoked. As a result, fédérés continued to pour into Paris long after 14 July on their way to the front. Marseille's volunteers did not arrive until 30th of July, when they marched into the capital singing Rouget de Lille's battle hymn, and thereby gave it the name it has borne ever since. And so, throughout July, Paris swarmed with the pick of the provincial patriots, and the Jacobins and popular societies made every effort to look after them and draft them into the political struggle. As early as 11 July, deputations of fédérés were urging the Assembly to impeach Lafayette, annul the royal veto, and reinstate Pétion. 2 days later, the mayor was restored as a goodwill gesture for the 14th. And the ceremony on the day itself was bigger and more spectacular than ever, with the king insisting on renewing his constitutional oath. But, as a moderate Jacobin noted, it was very fine to look at, but not in the hearts of the patriots. The latter were now openly talking of storming the Tuileries as the Bastille had been stormed, and establishing a republic. This time, however, they wanted the pressure to mount until it was irresistible. On several occasions, newly arrived fédérés had to be dissuaded from premature assaults on the palace. To ensure success, the sans-culottes had to be mobilized. And that could be best done if sectional assemblies were able to admit all citizens without distinction. It was illegal. But on 20 July, the Très Français section voted to ignore distinctions under the leadership of the most resourceful political operator on the left bank, Danton. Within a fortnight, 6 other sections had followed this example. And by early days of August, attendance at sectional assemblies was soaring. From 25th July, they were authorized to sit continuously. And by then, they were also beginning to coordinate their action and to concert it with the fédérés in a central committee. The Jacobin Club, too, was now increasingly open in its support for the overthrow of the monarchy by insurrection. On the 29th, even the ever-cautious Robespierre came out for direct action, abandoning the defense of the Constitution, which had been his watchword throughout the spring. The mounting sense of urgency was only increased by the news that the enemy had now crossed the northeast frontier. On 25th July, the Allied commander, the Duke of Brunswick, issued a declaration designed to strike terror into the inhabitants of Paris particularly. The war aims of the Emperor and the King of Prussia, he proclaimed, were to end the anarchy inside France and stop attacks on throne and altar. They intended to liberate the royal family and re-establish the king's legitimate authority. Those who offered no resistance to the Allied advance would be protected, and Parisians were explicitly warned to take no action against the Tuileries or its inhabitants. All in the capital were declared answerable for the safety of the king, failing which the city would be subjected to exemplary and forever memorable vengeance. News of these threats, which reached Paris on 28th July, prompted the Assembly to authorize distribution of arms to all citizens, active or otherwise, and to declare all defenders of the country active. Thus, the National Guard was open to all, swamping the cautious men of property who had hitherto dominated its Parisian units. And one by one, the sections began to petition openly for the king's immediate deposition. On 3rd August, Pétion presented the same demand to the Assembly in the name of all 48 sections, although some promptly disavowed it. On the 6th, there followed another petition, signed by all comers at the symbolic location of the Champ de Mars. Similar calls were now coming in from major provincial cities. Eventually, the Assembly agreed to debate the question on 9th of August, immediately after hearing a report on Lafayette's earlier desertion of his command. But events were now slipping beyond the deputy's control, to the alarm of none more than those who had hoped to gain from the fateful demonstration of 20th June. The dismissed ministers and their supporters among the Brissotins and the eloquent deputies from the Gironde. They had hoped that popular discontent would force the king to restore them to power. They had not expected a movement to develop for his total overthrow. But when the Bordeaux deputies, Vergniaud, Guadet, and Gensonné pressed the king to appoint ministers among the firmest supporters of the revolution, they received no response. Desperate to impress him with their sincerity, by the first week in August, they were openly denouncing calls for dethronement. All they achieved was to attract the suspicion of the sections and their fellow Jacobins, and make the insurrection, when it came, one as much against the Legislative Assembly as against the crown. The final signal came when the deputies refused to indict Lafayette on the 8th. From this, it was obvious that no clear decision on dethronement could be expected next day, and there was none. Both sides spent 9 August preparing for the long-awaited trial of strength, and the Assembly could only look on hopelessly. The ringing of the tocsin, notoriously the call to insurrection since the memorable Journée of 1789, marked the seizure of power in the small hours of the 10th by the Central Committee of the Sections, symbolically locking up Pétion. They proclaimed themselves an insurrectionary commune and ordered the fédérés and the newly democratized National Guard of the capital to march on the Tuileries. When these forces arrived there at 9 the next morning, they found that the king and his family had already fled to the presumed safety of the Assembly across the road. But a garrison remained of 900 well-armed Swiss guards, between 100 and 200 courtiers and former officers, and 2,000 National Guards. The latter at once defected to the Commune side, which was perhaps 20,000 strong. Nevertheless, it was the Swiss who opened fire, and that sealed their fate when the Commune's forces gained the upper hand after about an hour. Once the Swiss began to retreat, they were pursued by mobs of bystanders without firearms, who hacked them to death with knives, pikes, and hatchets, and tore their uniforms to pieces to make trophies. Although 600 of them perished, some in supposed safe custody after the siege was over, less than half that number fell among the besiegers, 90 of them fédérés, and the rest the same sort of shopkeepers, petty tradesmen, and artisans who had been so prominent in the 1789 Journées and on 20th of June. It was the bloodiest day of the revolution so far, but also one of the most decisive. Though the king and his family remained unscathed, his authority fell with his palace. As crowds rampaged through Paris, destroying all symbols and images of royalty, down to the very word king in streets' names, the Legislative Assembly declared the monarchy suspended until a national convention had met to decide on the future form of government. Only the efforts of Vergniaud averted the abolition of monarchy there and then. But as the king was transferred under close custody to the keep of the Temple, a medieval fortress in the northeastern suburbs, few believed that he would ever sit on the throne again unless with foreign aid. Power now lay not with the assembly, but with the new Paris Commune. The assembly acted as if it was still in charge. For example, it appointed a new team of ministers. The three who had fallen on 13th June were at last restored, tainted though they now were by association with the equivocating Brissotins. But the most sensational appointment was the new Minister of Justice, Danton, who had built a career entirely in the sectional politics of Paris since 1789, and was brought in explicitly to keep the sans-culottes happy. The appointments were made by less than 300 deputies. The majority had simply gone to ground over the previous few weeks, thus further diminishing the Assembly's authority. During the 6 weeks left to it, this rump did almost everything the Commune wanted. Such efforts as it made to resist were contemptuously brushed aside. What the Commune wanted most was vengeance on those who had abetted the king and those who had resisted the popular will before and during the uprising of 10th August, on refractory priests protected for too long by the deposed tyrant, and on Lafayette, the butcher of the Champ de Mars and would-be military dictator. He at least escaped after toying briefly with marching his army on Paris on 17 August, the day the Council of Ministers decided to dismiss him. He crossed the Prussian lines and gave himself up to the enemy. Even that brought him 5 years in Austrian prisons. On that same day, a special tribunal was set up to try those guilty of political crimes. such as the surviving defenders of the Tuileries. It worked slowly, but on the 21st, the guillotine dispatched its first political victim. Between the 19th and the 26th, the Assembly debated measures against refractories, which many local authorities were taking anyway on their own initiative. Eventually, it decreed that all non-jurors were to quit the country within a fortnight on pain of deportation to Guyana. But so deep had suspicion of priestcraft now gone that even unbeneficed clergy not subject to the oaths were made liable to deportation on the demand of 6 citizens. Suspicion was the order of the day, and priests were now being arrested by sans-culotte vigilantes from 11th August onward. Nobody was allowed to leave the capital without a passport, and none of these were issued without certificat de civisme issued by sectional surveillance committees. The paranoid atmosphere only grew worse when it was learned that the Prussians had invaded French territory. And news arriving on the 26th of the fall of Longwy, with scarcely any resistance, seemed to confirm that traitors were everywhere. The response of Danton, who increasingly dominated his fellow ministers during these weeks, was to demand a general search on all dwellings in the capital for hidden arms and suspects. These domiciliary visits took place on 30 through 31 of August, resulting in 3,000 further arrests. The result was to cram the prisons of Paris to bursting point with presumed traitors. After 10th August, Marat, the self-styled friend of the people, but hitherto too extreme and bloodthirsty in his opinions to command much support, came into his own. His solution to the crisis was massacre, both of the suspects herded together in the prisons, and indeed of selected ministers and deputies. Many sections and their representatives on the commune thought the same, and were disgusted by the slow progress made by the 17 August tribunal. When Danton, in response to the fall of Longwy, called for 30,000 volunteers from the capital to go to the front, many sans-culottes appeared ready to go, but were reluctant to leave their families at the mercy of a counter-revolutionary prison breakout. Nor were they reassured when, on 30 August, the Assembly attempted to shake off the Commune's control by decreeing new elections in Paris. The move was all too obviously inspired by Brissac and his friends, whom Robespierre was beginning to call the faction of the Gironde. It outraged those who regarded the Commune as the savior of the country. The Commune refused to be disbanded, and after hints from Robespierre at the Jacobins, tried to have a number of hostile deputies and ministers arrested. It also defiantly drafted Marat onto its committee of surveillance, responsible for the prisons. The personal intervention of Danton prevented the arrests, and thereby probably saved the lives of those concerned. For if they had been in prison on 2nd September, they would almost certainly have fallen victim to these September massacres. The trigger was further bad news from the front. After Longwy, Verdun came under Prussian siege. And on 2nd September, news came that the enemy had passed it. There were no other fortresses on the road to Paris. Danton, in his famous speech, urged his compatriots to defiance. If we are bold, bolder still and forever bold, then France is saved. But the predominant mood in Paris was panic. That afternoon, a convoy of prisoners going from the Hôtel de Ville to the Abbaye prison were stopped and attacked by sans-culottes. 17 of them were hacked to death. Soon afterwards, a makeshift prison at the old Carmelite convent was attacked, and there was more butchery, although most of it was now directed by a kangaroo court. By the end of the afternoon, the Commune had taken a hand, but only to coordinate the massacres, not to stop them. The next day, it sent a circular to provincial centers hinting that they might like to follow the Parisian example. By then, all except 2 of the capital's prisons had been broken into. Makeshift tribunals established claiming to dispense the people's justice, and vengeance visited on all those deemed from the charges against them to be potential counter-revolutionaries. Extravagant celebrations and cheering marked each acquittal, and there were plenty of them. Even so, about half the prison population of Paris, between 1,100 and 1,400 people, were killed between 2nd September and the last incidents on the 7th. And most of the victims were in no sense politically dangerous. Certainly, they included surviving Swiss defenders of the Tuileries, over 200 priests, and a number of prominent relics of the old order, such as the former foreign minister Montmorin, or the Queen's notorious favorite, the Princess de Lamballe. 45 political prisoners were also massacred at Versailles on the 9th, including Delasart. But most of those who died were common criminals, forging assignats being the nearest any of them came to subversive activity. Nevertheless, suspicion bred credulity, and society's reprobates could not be presumed unavailable for the purposes of prison plotters. The ordinary Parisian tradesmen and artisans who carried out the killings certainly thought their work both necessary and beneficial, and so did the commune, which voted to pay them for it. But this second great bloodletting, within a month, horrified most of those who witnessed it. And the lurid details were soon known throughout Europe. Nobody at the Assembly or the Jacobin Club was prepared openly to commend what had been done. But the political factions led by Brissot on one side and Robespierre on the other were quick to accuse each other of responsibility or complicity. And these charges and counter-charges would echo on for years. Septembrissure became a standard term of political abuse, and fear of a repetition stalked political life for months to come. Yet, this purging of their enemies certainly seemed to reassure the sans-culottes. With the threat to their families removed, the men of Paris began to volunteer in droves to go off and face the Prussians. 20,000 came forward during the first weeks of September. The number of men, for I cannot call them troops, wrote a British agent on September 9, that have left for the army is prodigious, and they are still enrolling. I have heard today that the multitude of people that are besides this, either at or going to Chalon, is beyond belief. The cause among the lower order of people is more popular than I imagined. And although he was convinced as a military man that they must tend more to create confusion in a regular army than to be of any advantage to it, nevertheless, I cannot help thinking the Duke of Brunswick ought to get before Paris as quick as he can. We see here a dim awakening to the fact that the ordered practice of 18th century warfare was perhaps not immutable. And proof positive came only 10 days later. On 20 September at Valmy, just east of Chalon, the French forces at last made a stand. Kellerman and the Dumouriez had more men than the Prussians. They had fewer guns, but those they had were superior and handled by graduates of the outstanding pre-revolutionary gunnery schools. They outgunned the enemy, and when they followed up their advantage, the French charged cries of Vive la Nation, and the singing of Ça ira. They fought with an enthusiasm and determination not seen on European battlefields for generations. And they stopped the invaders in their tracks. Watching all this was Goethe, brought along by the Duke of Weimar to enliven the expected military promenade. In the stunned disappointment of the Prussian camp, that damp night he offered Job's comfort to his fellow invaders. Here and today, he told them, a new epoch in the history of the world has begun, and you can boast you were present at its birth. The Prussians, in fact, had once opened negotiations. King Frederick William was there to authorize them when Dumouriez, who had never believed in their commitment to the Austrian alliance, made the offer. The Revolutionary War might also have ended there and then, but on the day Valmy was fought, the National Convention finally met in Paris, and its first act was to declare a republic. The Prussians promptly broke off negotiations and withdrew. The idea of a convention predated the revolution of 10th August. Radicals in the sections and at the Jacobin Club had been talking of the need to produce a new constitution throughout July. Thus, on the afternoon of 10th August, the Legislative Assembly had little alternative but to invite the French people to form a convention to assure the sovereignty of the people and the reign of liberty and equality. The next day, it decreed that the new assembly was to be elected by manhood suffrage, without distinction between citizens. Only servants and the unemployed had no vote. But at least the legislative resisted the section's desire that election should be direct, stipulating a two-stage process, and it equally overrode Robespierre's suggestion of another self-denying ordinance, seeing that it would let him in but keep all sitting deputies out. The primary elections took place on 27 August, the secondary on 2nd of September, at the very height of the national emergency. No doubt, this helps to explain the fact that out of 6 million electors, only about 1 in 4 or 5 turned up to vote in the primary assemblies. And the patchy and uncertain information that many of the departments had about the revolution of 10th August and subsequent events in Paris no doubt indicates why no less than 200 of the 749 deputies returned were members of the legislative, and therefore already well known to those who elected them. They included Brissot and his circle and all the most prominent orators from the Gironde. 83 members of the former Constituent Assembly also now reappeared on the national stage, including Orléans, proudly flaunting the new Republican name of Philippe Égalité, Pétion, and Robespierre. all three sitting for Paris. Danton's election was a foregone conclusion. Although it brought his resignation from the ministry, journalistic notoriety secured almost equally inevitable seats for Marat and Clootz. Frenchmen also recognized their foreign friends by electing Tom Paine and Joseph Priestley. Socially, like its predecessors, the new assembly was dominated by lawyers, professional men, and property owners, and although mercantile, noble, and clerical numbers were smaller than ever, for the first time in the national representation, there was a handful of assorted artisans. It was a young body with 2/3 of deputies under 45. Above all, it brought together a wide range of political experience at both national and local level. Experience scarred since the beginning of 1791 by the obstinate, treacherous behavior of the king.